So it's 5:33 and we have around 50 participants. So do you want to begin?
Sure, whenever. Yeah, I think so. Sir is there? Dr. Kotar is there?
I'm there. Let's start. Let's start. Datta.
Yes. Good evening, everyone.
Yeah.
I welcome to this very interesting topic, what is health? And I'm going to introduce a very great speaker, Dr. Peter Sterling. He is a neuroscientist and as a professor of neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. And he has a significant contribution to the knowledge about three-dimensional retinal microanatomy and the concept of allostasis, a new concept in the health. And all of us know about during our medical education, the importance of homeostasis, where the body reacts to the lower and the local changes happens, correcting the errors. But to be efficient, you need to be preventing the errors rather than correcting the errors. And this is a new concept of allostasis. Professor Peter Sterling has written many books, of which the recently published What is Health, published in February 2020, and which gives us a different dimension about the health. So I introduce and I welcome Dr. Peter Sterling for his talk, interesting talk.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Kothari, for inviting me to speak. It's sort of amazing to speak to you from, I'm speaking to you from Panama, where I live now on a small farm where we grow oranges and avocados and sugar canes. It's a very little, it's way out in the country. Nevertheless, by the miracle of internet, I can speak to you. It's very early in the morning here, the birds are singing, and it's sort of amazing. As Dr. Nadgir said, my laboratory focused for many years on studying the fine scale neural circuits and leading ultimately to this book that I wrote with Simon Laughlin. Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I should continue. Okay, the point of this book is that the brain is smarter than a supercomputer, but uses 100,000-fold less energy and space. And this efficiency of the brain is fostered by 10 principles of efficient design. So the body must also be efficient because it uses 80% of the total energy. And this is important, but the central concept of physiology, homeostasis, which has dominated medicine for really 150 years, makes no reference to efficiency. I can't quite see my own, can I move this? Up? Yeah, okay, I can do that. Yeah, okay, good. So homeostasis is about correcting errors by feedback, but efficiency requires actually preventing errors. And so what happens is that the brain predicts our needs, all of our needs, and then regulates physiology and behavior to meet them. And Joseph Iyer and I call this allostasis. Dr. Nadgir said this is a new concept, but actually we call this allostasis almost more than 30 years ago. And it's just taken a while for the idea to begin to catch on. So recently I've updated the story with Jay Shulkin in a paper called Allostasis, Predictive Regulation in Trends in Neurosciences. So this February, I published a new book called What is Health, which concerns allostasis and human evolution. And it asks the question, what does our species, Homo sapiens, require for a healthy life? And it asks, can we achieve this with drugs? It also asks, if the body has to be efficient and the brain has to be efficient, why did our brain invest in art and music and things like that? That doesn't sounds rather expensive and not maybe efficient. And I'll consider this in the talk. So I want to begin by discussing hypertension, which is, you all know as physicians, is a cause of serious pathology of the heart, kidney, and the brain, strokes, and so on. Hypertension is prevalent in modern society, and it's especially prevalent among the most stressed populations, such as in the US, for example, among African Americans. Now, the first point I want to make concerns hypertension in communities that live simply like this. This is a Nobe Indian community living in the forest in Panama. This is 2 days walk. I visited this group. They're on the Caribbean slope in Panama. And I visited this family. It's 2 days walk from the nearest town. Now, blood pressures of people who live like this, foragers and horticulturalists, they're growing banana and plantain and various other root crops. Blood pressures of foragers like this are low and steady with age. And this is true both in South America, Central America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and essentially everywhere that people live simply like this, their blood pressures are low and steady with age. To the contrary, in the US, blood pressures rise from the beginning as children enter school. So this is age, and this is systolic blood pressure. And you can see that both for boys and for girls, the pressure starts to rise just about age 6 when we enter school, and that by the age of graduation, around 18, 25% of the population has already pressures above 140 millimeters of mercury, that is in the hypertensive range. So the rise is steepest for African Americans. And for the reason is that in the US, Black lives, African American lives still don't matter. Now, this is a 24-hour record of blood pressure. This is 12 noon, 12 midnight. And this is arterial pressure measured directly with an indwelling catheter, cannula. And this is systolic, and below is diastolic. And what I want to call your attention to is that blood pressure is varying all over the place. And for example, at this point here, it's 3 in the afternoon, and the subject is sitting in lecture, and he's beginning to relax, and he dozes off, and his pressure comes down. Then a neighbor jabs him with a pin, and his brain wakes up and predicts danger and raises the pressure. Then he sees that, well, this is sort of a prank, a joke, and his blood pressure falls back down. He goes back to sleep, pressure falls down. And then it continues up and down during the rest of the day. This is now midnight, and at this point, he becomes sexually aroused. His blood pressure, brain says you need more blood pressure. It rises, and following sex, it falls precipitously, and during sleep, it's extremely low. And then the next day, as he rises and he's getting ready to cope with his day, his children, his work, the pressure rises into the hypertensive range. Now, this is allostasis. Note that the pressure is exquisitely tuned to each change in state, each need. And the idea is the brain provides just enough, just in time. And this is allostasis, and where the brain predicts what's going to be needed and adjusts the pressure to match. And it provides, as I said, just enough, just in time. And over this wide dynamic range, the system is exquisitely responsive. And this is health, exquisite responsiveness. So for efficiency, all the systems in the body adapt to predicted demand. And arteries, for example, adapt to the predicted mean pressure. So, so this is the record we just saw, and the mean pressure is something around 100. And for this level, 100 millimeters of mercury, the arteries can be rather modest in cross-sectional thickness. But when the blood pressure rises so that the predicted mean is near 160 millimeters of mercury, gradually, with the exercise, the arteries become thickened to sustain this pressure. And this is, and at a certain point, and this is sort of like skeletal muscles that increase their strength from exercise, from lifting weights. So these arteries become thicker, and eventually the lumen is narrowed, and the higher pressure is required just to force the blood through this narrow lumen. Now, the brain controls the pressure, all the mechanisms for pressure. So for example, the brain sends nerves to the kidney to control hormones that set plasma volume, how much salt water the kidney retains for the vascular system. The brain also controls the rate of the heart, and its contractility. And so it can increase pressure by increasing salt water and by increasing heart rate and contraction. And it also can increase vascular resistance by constricting blood vessels. And all of these three factors raise the pressure. The brain also controls salt appetite, because when it wants to increase the amount of salt water, we need to have extra salt. And so it directs individual to search out and eat salt. And naturally, when you're most stressed and your brain is raising your pressure, it raises your salt appetite. And J.P. Henry, who studied this experimentally for many years, noted that psychosocial arousal induces salt appetite, making a society's salt consumption a measure of its social stress. Now, drugs, of course, one wants to control hypertension because it's very damaging. And so the standard treatments are drugs that can block each different mechanism. And they're quite effective, but for each mechanism that's blocked, the brain compensates. So for example, if you give a diuretic to someone who's hypertensive to increase their diuresis, their shedding, losing salt water, the brain causes the heart rate to increase. You can block the heart rate increase with a drug, beta blocker, which you all are familiar with. But of course, that causes, the brain still knows it wants to raise the pressure. So it increases vascular resistance. It contracts the blood vessels more. And you can block that too with a calcium channel blocker. And then when you finally use 2 or 3 or 4 different drugs, you can gain control over the pressure. But then the system is unable to respond to new predictions. And I'm fairly old now, and I walk with some older men, and many of them take beta blockers, and we're fine as long as we're walking along a flat road. But the minute we slightly go up a hill, they have to slow down and stop and catch their breath, because they can't, their system can't respond to this new demand. Now, a beta blocker all these drugs act at many points. A beta blocker, in addition to affecting the heart, also causes a rise in blood glucose, and that is generally exacerbates type 2 diabetes. And so you can give drugs to control the blood glucose and the type 2 diabetes, but then basically what you have to give drugs and more drugs. And what you end up with is basically a sick patient who's precariously stabilized by polypharmacy, many drugs. So now I'd like to consider first of all some problems with U.S. health. Of course, these problems are somewhat different from other parts of the world, but they're similar also in many ways. And you know more, you can take from what I'm talking about as a US issue and figure out how this applies to India, which of course is a huge, diverse country, about which I know very little. So I'm going to stick to the US, and I would like to connect these problems to aspects of our neural design. And also, at the end, try to suggest simple things that we must do. So the first point is that in the US, the death rates have been rising among adults for all causes. So this is age-adjusted mortality rate for people who are around 50 years old, born around 1970. And this is death rate. And you can see that in Europe and Canada, Australia, the death rates have been coming down. But about 25 years ago in the US, they were coming down. They started to turn up again and have continued to rise to this very day. And of course, with COVID, they're rising even more steeply. But so this rise is steepest for the population that for the causes of drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And again, these are people now who are about 50 years old. This is just an example from whites, US whites. And this rise in deaths of despair, drugs, alcohol, and suicide is much higher, fourfold higher for men without a college education and no education beyond high school. And in the US, this constitutes 60% of white males. So, so these deaths of despair are rising steeply for the younger cohort. So this is deaths of despair, deaths per 100,000. And this is 1970 cohort. These are people who are now about 50, and they cross the 100 deaths per 100,000 line at about age 45. Whereas the 40-year-olds who were born in 1980 crossed this same line at 35. And for the still younger ages, the rise is steeper. So obesity in the US is also rising. This is 1980, this is 2010, and you can see the line goes up, and it's rising caused by eating too much foods of this rich foods of despair, sweets and fat, and by lack of exercise. In the US, there's also a rise in mass shootings, and this rise in mass shootings strikingly follows this overall rise of despair. So I called them murders of despair. So what causes our collective despair? I would like to consider two features of our neural design, of our species design. One is that we have a huge brain. This is the human brain. It's 3.5 times the size of the chimpanzee, which is our closest living relative. A chimpanzee can, for example, can forage over 6 kilometers squared. whereas a human forages over 12,000 kilometers squared. Now, a chimpanzee, so this is age, and this is net production of calories per day. And infants at birth are not, mammals are not able to take care of themselves. So a chimpanzee takes its parents' food until about age 5. It's about able to take care of, to forage for itself, feed itself. And then by age 15, it reaches the skills to go beyond what it needs for its own self and can support reproduction, support the next generation. Humans have this huge caloric debt. They just take food, and they can't do anything, and they only cross the zero line, able to feed themselves by about age 20. And so for any of you out there who have teenage children and you're wondering why they're so maybe not so helpful, this is part of our species inheritance. They won't be able to do anything until about age 20. And then between age 20, they become, after age 20, they become progressively more skillful. Their productivity increases from age 20. This is for hunting and gathering through till about age 45, they peak, and then they continue to be net producers well beyond age 60. So the point is that for 200,000 years after we emerged as a species, gathering and hunting food were challenging careers that demanded prolonged study and practice, and this lent meaning to our lives. Now, the next point about our neural design is this. The brain obeys the principle, specialize, and it does so because this conserves energy in space. This is the subject of my first book with Simon Laughlin, and this is something that everybody agrees about. So the brain, the human brain, cerebral cortex, has divided itself up into about 200 specialized cortical circuits per brain. And we now know they're numbered, and we know a lot about their function. But the point here is that once you reach this space limit, our skull is full, so you can't add any more new areas, and you can't increase, basically, you can't increase the memory capacity or the intelligence of an individual brain. And so reaching this limit of space for an individual brain, we specialized across brains. And that means that when you look at these areas, for each person, the areas are somewhat unique. Some people recognize faces, some people can't recognize them at all. Other people are super recognizers. And the same is true for music and art and map reading and athletic ability and so on. Each person gets a unique set of skills. This unique set of innate abilities is a terrific advantage, because we practice our innate abilities because that's what is most rewarding. A child who's really athletic goes out and plays athletics, and someone who's really good at music does that because it's very satisfying. And so this produces, even in a small community where we evolved, a community of experts, a hunter, a healer, a navigator, and so on. And so communal intelligence certainly outcompetes a design where everyone in the community is the same. So this makes us awesome as a species, but there are costs. And one, of course, is mental distress. And another is interpersonal conflict. And so we have to find ways, if we're going to cooperate to get the benefit of our varied skills, we have to find a way to cooperate. And to benefit this communal intelligence, we must cohere in some way. And this is achieved by what I call sacred practice. That is, what words alone cannot express. So the brain invested in costly circuits that go beyond foraging. For example, when we migrated out of Africa, made our way to Indonesia 44,000 years ago, among the first things that we did as a species was to paint on cave walls. And if you look at this drawing, this is a very skilled drawing. This is not, I couldn't do this myself. This is some member or members of this cave community who put this, to put up these paintings and invested energy into it. We also invested in music, and this is a flute, bone flute from a cave in Germany from 40,000 years ago. So there are other aspects we have that haven't survived that are not preserved physically, but dance, music, or telling stories and so on are all part of this sacred practice. And these all of these activities elicit intense emotions, awe, grief, joy, laughter, pleasure, and that releases tensions and allows cooperation. So this is why our brain has invested in areas, circuits for art and other sacred practice. Now, one consequence, communal intelligence, it took 200,000 years, but fairly recently, just about 250 years ago, the communal intelligence produced a steam engine. And what this did is to rapidly transform first England and then the whole world. And this transformation, industrial transformation, is marked by the rise of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is CO2 concentration, this is time, and this explosive exponential growth of CO2 started back in 1769 with the introduction of the steam engine. Robert Watt has attributed the invention of this engine. He took the patent, but it was really developed by a host of his engineers with slide rules that had been invented, and they understood the newly described gas laws and so on. So at this point, Adam Smith was the famous Scottish economist who was a neighbor and friend of Watt, said this. He said, the man whose life, he recognized what was about to happen. He said, a man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding or exercise his invention, and he naturally loses the habit of exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Actually, we're not stupid. The problem is that we're still smart, but as a society, we've narrowed the possibilities to exercise our gifts. So we evolved to explore the planet. We left Africa, we went to down the continent of India, we crossed the Pacific, we went to Australia, we went to the Siberia, crossed over into the New World. But now, multitudes just punch a ticket or scan a barcode or do something that really is beneath our intellectual and spirit of adventure. So jobs learned in minutes or days just don't prevent sufficient a challenge. And it's this mismatch between our abilities as a species and our opportunities to exercise them that cause our despair. So what links despair to compulsive consumption? Well, for one thing, we inherited a circuit for seeking. We got this from primitive worms from whom we descended. And this circuit rewards an unpredicted find with a pulse of dopamine. The circuit drives us to seek something, and when we find it, that's something valuable that we didn't expect, we get this little pulse of dopamine. And here's an example, a recording. Each dot here is a nerve action potential by a single neuron, and this is time on this axis, and this time is a few seconds, and it brackets the arrival, the appearance of an unpredicted reward. This is to probably to a monkey, and this histogram is a sum of all of these trials, and what it shows is every time the subject gets an unpredicted reward, it has neurons that spike and produce this pulse of dopamine. Now, this pulse of dopamine is experienced as a pulse of satisfaction, and that allows us to pause in our seeking. It gives us a moment of relief. And of course, as the pulse dissipates, seeking resumes to serve the next need. Now, foragers find food unpredictably. As they go through the forest, they find a root or a nut or a berry, and they get a pulse. Each time they get a pulse of dopamine. They also find comfort unpredictably, a warm cave, a dry cave, a warm fire, and so on. And each time they find a little bit of comfort, a place to rest, they get a drop of dopamine. So all in all, the way foragers live produces frequent pulses of dopamine. But we find food, many of us, the ones who are comfortable, we find food and comfort predictably without effort or surprise. And the thing is that when you get to, so this is a same recording, same neuron as this experiment, but when the reward is predicted, as you can see, there's very little dopamine involved. So because predicted rewards provide less dopamine, we lacking these frequent pulses, we grow restless and anxious, and we seek ways to find our dopamine. And what this means is that we go for rich foods, which produce a great surge of dopamine, or alcohol, cocaine, all these drugs, nicotine, amphetamines, all produce great surges of dopamine. And the problem is that once you get a great surge, that's predicted, and what you need to be to get the next surge is an even bigger surge. So we go from a Mac hamburger to a Big Mac to a Whopper, and we go from a little bit of cocaine to a little more to lots of cocaine or alcohol. So all of these substances and activities that provide big bits of dopamine that replace our frequent small pulses tend to adapt and to demand ever more, and that is what drives the whole family of addictions. So what do we do? Well, we now are treating despairing populations that have obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and addictions. We're treating them at the molecular level. But I maintain that polypharmacy, as I described for hypertension, is not a plausible route to health. Moreover, it's extremely expensive. And so if we found that because it's so expensive, in the US, there's a lot of arguing about how to pay for healthcare. But of course, if we had something that was less expensive, we wouldn't argue so much about the cost. So what to do? Well, the first thing is that health, as I'm talking about it, requires social inclusion. Everybody must feel that their lives actually matter. And once that is established, there's less stress across the whole population. The second point is that by simply reducing inequality, we improve health. And this, I recommend this book called The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, which shows a great deal of data supporting this. The second point is that health requires practicing our gifts across the whole lifespan. Automation, of course, is progressively reducing job quality. So it's not more jobs that we need, because we're not going to have jobs. They're going to be replaced a lot by automation, and they get worse and worse, simpler and simpler. So what we need instead of jobs is challenging activities. The third thing that we need is to expand sacred practice. Right now, many of us we click for products of sacred practice: Spotify, Netflix, ESPN, Pornhub, and so on. But these provide vicarious experience. You can listen to a concert, but you're not playing it. And vicarious experience cannot substitute for real participation. So fourth thing is that health requires accommodating communal intelligence. And our gifts are quantitative traits that are governed by hundreds of genes that emerge under good conditions. So this is an example. Sean Bradley, he's 7'6". He was a basketball player in college and then for the professional basketball in the US. And the way it works is that a height is a trait that's governed by hundreds of genes. And this is Sean Bradley way out here. And it's because he got several hundred genes for tall, more than average. So, of course, he not only got these extra genes for tall, but he was also well fed. And without that, he would have been much shorter. So height comes from lots of genes plus good nutrition. Well, what we're understanding now is that many of our liabilities are also population traits that are polygenically determined. They're not diseases. They're traits that emerge with poor conditions. So for example, hypertension, obesity, drug addiction, alcoholism, and various kinds of madness are genes, are controlled by hundreds of genes that are brought out by stress and despair. So if we put despair on this axis, I think we could identify the mass shooter as being out here at the extreme of despair. It's not necessarily diseased, he's just overwhelmed by despair. So just as physical growth, height requires good food, cognitive and emotional growth require nurturing for everyone on this trait distribution. So I would like to call your attention also, you'll have this available, to a lecture by a man named Dan Geschwind, who's a neurologist at UCLA, who has a lecture describing this polygenic determinant of various traits, including various forms of mental disorder. And it's a terrific lecture worth studying. So in conclusion, health is responsiveness. It cannot be achieved, I think, by polypharmacy. Our brain evolved to support lives of physical, cognitive, and emotional adventure, learning across the lifespan. And so it's our responsibility to live such lives and to help others live them. So thank you very much, and I'll be glad to have some questions now. Thank you. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Even Dr. you want to ask?
Yeah, thank you for a fantastic talk and really changed the definition of health and the disease. And there are a couple of questions.
Peter, can you stop sharing the screen at the top of your screen, there will be stop sharing. So you can click that.
Okay, but I might want to show a slide or two. So,
I think you want to show those first.
okay, we'll just stop that. I can start it again. Yeah, okay.
A couple of good questions. One, um, what is the role of small pleasures in increasing the dopamine, and how do you ensure this regular surges of dopamine in the uh, day-to-day activities?
Well, that's a good question. I think what we need is diverse activities. If you just do the same thing hour after hour, day after day, um, you're not going to get any surprises from those activities, and so you're likely to seek uh, other sources, such as eating a lot of rich food or um, drinking a lot of alcohol or something like that. So I think what you need is diverse activities, and you definitely need exercise. We evolved to walk great distances and expend a lot of energy, physical energy. And so when we don't get any exercise, we just sit here like this at the computer. Our whole system is sort of begins to adjust to be sitting still, and you lose your muscle and you lose your other respiratory capacity. The minute this session is over, I'm going out for a walk, and I can walk in my neighborhood up into the forest for 2 hours, and I'm going to come back and I'll sleep better tonight. I had to get up pretty early this morning.
Many of young neurologists he is asking that work often becomes mundane. Every migraine sounds the same. Every Parkinson looks the same. So how do you get uh, pleasure in day-to-day work or job
How do you get pleasure in day-to-day work?
and job?
Well, I think it requires variety of activities. It requires something that demands the maximum of your intelligence. And of course, people differ in intelligence. They differ in their ability to pay attention and so on. So there have to be a variety of activities that are matched to people's ability. And I think one thing that schools in the US, I imagine in most places, just try to cram all students to do the same thing and to sit and listen to the teacher, the same teacher all day, or change teachers. But I think what we need to do is to have a sort of education which helps children find what they're good at and what they can then practice. And they will get dopamine from that, from things that they really are good at.
So, for example, I mean, like one could you could see manage every patient of migraine as just a migraine, and then decide whether I want to give blue drug or white drug or red drug, and it no longer becomes interesting. But if you try to probe each patient and try to find out what might be wrong with this person's lifestyle, what might be causing his stress, and then try to unearth that and then solve that, then it will give you a little pleasure. Simple case of migraine, do you think that is a good strategy?
Uh, Hard for me to get, you're dropping a bit. So just what was the last point?
The point is that you try to find some sort of variety or some challenge in every patient that you see and get some enjoyment from every patient that you see rather than look upon it as just a routine patient which you just have to prescribe something.
Yes, exactly. If you just see patient after patient and you say, oh yeah, they're this, and I'll give you a drug, you write a prescription, not so interesting. If you see each patient as a challenge and a puzzle because people are so individual, then sure, you're going to get more pleasure out of that health, taking care of people. The other point is that an important source of pleasure and small rewards for many people, many humans, is giving to other people. And every time we give something, a gift of our time or our attention or some material gift, we get a drop of dopamine. Now, this isn't true for everybody. This has to do with empathy. And even rats, by the way, if you have a rat in a laboratory that's trapped in a small trap, another rat walks by and sees the trapped rat, it will take the trouble to release the rat. This isn't true for all rats, but a certain number of them will do this. And so our capacity for empathy and altruistic behavior goes back 100 million years, but it also, like height, has a distribution. So half the population has a strong empathy, and the other half is like height, has a declining amount of empathy. And so the people who really have the least empathy and can act without concern for other people, those are the people who become our politicians and our leaders. And so they just act, they don't give a damn about anybody. And that's a problem in our country right now. And so you can't expect, many people can expect to get small drops of pleasure from helping, but there's other people for whom this is not that satisfying.
In which animal did this dopamine reward circuit develop first?
I don't know. That's a good question, but certainly since rodents, we split off. Our common ancestor with rodents, was about 100 million years ago. Probably empathy and altruism was present in the neural circuits for the ancestor that gave us rats and humans in the long run, that branched off very early.
Datta, take the questions.
Yeah. Dr. Roop Gurusani wants to know your comments about what Richa said. Medicine is a social science and politics is nothing but medicine on a large scale. What are your comments?
Well, I think it could be. I think it should be. Politics should be about helping people, helping care for people who are in need, making sure that everybody has a fair chance to develop their genetic potential. So the people who get tall genes the people who get genes for short also need food. And so the people who are mentally pained need care. So yeah, so whatever politics can do to make that better on a large scale is important. Yes, I agree with that.
Okay. Next question about the philosophy, Indian philosophy. There is a theory of karma yoga or nishkam karma in Indian philosophy, where work without thinking about the results. And how will it affect the dopamine surges? Is seeking a dopamine surge a good or a bad thing?
Say this again.
Yeah, is seeking dopamine surge a good or a bad thing? Because in Indian philosophy,
yeah.
there is a...
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Of course, India has such a tradition of all kinds of contemplative activities that the rest of the world needs and actually uses, and now does yoga by Zoom, and that's what my daughter's doing. So the question is seeking a drop of dopamine good or bad? Often neuroscientists talk about dopamine as providing pleasure. I think about it, sure, if you take a big drug and you get a huge surge of pleasure, you're aware of that connection between the dopamine and pleasure. But really, this is a fundamental circuit that regulates all of our activity, all of our seeking, our sleeping, all of our activities. And so it's not that we're seeking dopamine, it's that we are seeking something, and we can only stop when we get that little drop of dopamine. We get some relief because there's something pushing us constantly to do something. And so we don't really have a choice of not seeking dopamine. It's part of our circuit, and I suppose you can, by discipline, you can suppress your needs for food and water and salt and sex and social activities. But there comes a time when our fundamental physiology demands that we seek these things. So, of course, this is a long, complicated question. That's the best I can do in 30 seconds.
Yeah. Dr. Nadir Barucha wants to know your thoughts about the stress. Now, stress can also induce epigenetic changes like telomeres shortening, both during individual's lifespan and intergenerationally. So what are your thoughts about telomere shortening and the stress?
Well, I've read, there's a book called about telomeres, popular book, big book, that explains how shortening of your telomeres by stress shortens your life, ruins your health, and so on. It's a very interesting, skillful book written by Elizabeth Blackburn, who got the Nobel Prize for discovering telomeres, and a psychologist, Alyssa Epel, who I recently met in San Francisco. And sure, they show that stress, this is one effect of stress, is to shorten your telomeres and make epigenetic changes that affect the next generation. So, the more we can reduce stress in our population, the healthier we're going to be.
Yeah. Dr. Mishra wants to know how much is the contribution of modern digital gadgets like computer, cell phone, TV for poor health, and how to overcome this new form of addiction.
Well, it is potentially an addictive. I have to remind myself there are many interesting things that come to us via our computers and our cell phones. And I have to remind myself to put it down and go out into the forest and take a walk. So like everything else, a sword has two edges, and we have to, we depend on this sort of communication, especially now, my gosh. We haven't seen, my wife and I are living in this small house together for the last month, and we haven't seen our friends directly in a long time, but fortunately we can celebrate, for example, we just celebrated the holiday of Passover with my daughter and her family who are in the US by Zoom as we are now. So it's, one has to be careful. One has to keep in touch with the real world by going out. And that's what I'm going to do in about 15 minutes.
Dr. Roop wants to know, how do you make doctors socially conscious?
Well, I've been working on that since about 1969 when I arrived at the University of Pennsylvania. I taught medical students for many years. And my answer was that I just presented this sort of material, my book opens with a chapter about my first early experience with medical students, explaining the importance of sacred practice. And what I saw was that about a third of the students were very responsive to my story. It was about Dr. Oliver Sacks and one of his patients. And about a third of the students sort of got it, but it didn't impact them so strongly. And about a third of the students didn't get it at all and were quite annoyed with my wasting their time about talking about the importance of sacred practice. So that's my experience is, you can provide food for those and support for those who are interested, and the ones who aren't You just have to let them go.
Yeah. Dr. Mishra wants to know, don't you think compassion is better to practice than empathy?
Say it again.
Compassion is better to practice than empathy.
Compassion is, I think maybe I'm wrong, but I think they might be related. I mean, if you feel empathy, if you feel you understand another's pain, what they're probably feeling, and you express support or sympathy with that, I think it's linked somehow. Is that right?
Yeah. You have some time?
Me, yeah, I got all day. It's early here.
I had to come down some little pleasures of life. I have to take my dog for a walk. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you something. There is this concept about migraine being a disorder of allostasis. Do you subscribe to that?
Hello?
Yeah, I'm here, but I couldn't hear Sudhir.
Yeah, Dr. Rup Gurusan has commented, thanks for an eye-opening talk. Just bought both of your books. Unfortunately, can't ask you to autograph them.
If I could, I would, but maybe someday.
Yeah, there's one interesting question. It is a flight or reaction, basically, which is what we are trying to rein in through our lifetime. Does the inability to rein in this day today contribute to the obsessive compulsive behavior and future dementia also? Does the inflammation status on the overdrive through our flight reaction also cause future dementia? What about small dose of nicotine probably avoiding dementia? The role of inflammation, dementia, and the role of nicotine to prevent inflammation.
Of nicotine?
Yeah.
Gosh, I don't know anything about that. I think in terms of dementia, my experience. I mean, I'm about to turn 80 in a month, and so many of my friends are my age, and my impression is that for most people, the more active they are physically, the more active they are intellectually, the longer they keep their what we call their marbles. So I just think dementia to some extent. Of course, I lose some memory and wear a hearing aid, and hearing aids definitely are important for continuing communication. And so I think that the most important thing is living a healthy life as best you can.
Yeah. One more interesting question. We all have been studying pathogenesis and pathology, which leads to a disease understanding. We often fail to realize that many diseases which we force ourselves to treat are self-limiting. A migraine resolving by a nap, RCVS resolving. How can we study the reverse pathogenesis, or in my terminology, physiogenesis? Do you think that this would result in more effective mechanism of treatment devoid of polypharmacy?
Didn't quite get that.
Yeah, how can we study the reverse pathogenesis?
Yes.
Or physiogenesis? Do you think that this would result in a more effective mechanism of treatment devoid of polypharmacy if we know the pathogenesis of a particular disease? Because we have been studying this pathogenesis and pathology, which leads to a disease understanding. We often fail to realize that many diseases which we force ourselves to treat are self-limiting. Many diseases are self-limiting. A migraine resolving by a nap, RCVS resolving spontaneously. How can we study the reverse pathogenesis?
Well, I think we study it just as we do clinical studies of polypharmacy. We have a randomized group of experimental and control, and we give one group drugs, we give another group nothing and do nothing, and we give another group find constructive ways to improve their daily little
There's
shots of
one more.
dopamine.
Yeah. Yeah.
See what happens, and very often it's effective. Exercise is demonstrated to have a huge beneficial effect on heart disease, headache, mental capacity, and so on. So I would say this is one thing that you can do is to get people to find ways to exercise and to also exercise their special abilities to play. If they have musical talent, they should take up the instrument that they played when they were a child and pick it up again.
There's a couple of interesting questions on the spiritual health. As we know, the spiritual health has a tremendous role in preventing chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes. Do you believe this Indian art and science, like meditation and other spiritual practices, prevents the chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, and promotes health? What is your take on the role of spiritual health? Because maybe that will prevent the surge of dopamine, but how come it has a role in preventing chronic disease like hypertension and diabetes?
Well, I think spiritual health reduces,
especially meditation.
Meditation, yes.
Yes.
I think spiritual health activities of all kinds. I mean, you can do meditation by sitting still and closing your eyes and chanting. That's one way. Another way is to I get a lot out of just gardening. I go out in the garden and I bend over and I pull weeds and I grow vegetables and I see what I notice the insects that are trying to compete with me for the vegetables. And so there are many ways to be spiritual. My son plays music on a guitar. So yeah, I think all of these things, they reduce our need for huge surges of dopamine, but they give us these small drops that we need.
So do you believe these practices are really have a role in preventing chronic diseases?
Absolutely, absolutely. Your blood pressure, if I go out in the garden, I'm sure that my blood pressure goes down. Yeah.
I think, yeah. Thank you. I think that's all. And thank you for a fantastic talk.
Great.
And
Well,
given a different concept of health,
yes,
as adaptive responsiveness. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Thank you.
Good luck to you all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yeah. Thanks, Sudhir. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello, Mansi.
Yes, sir. I'll end the meeting.
Yeah. Sir is there?
Sir, I think he's gone.
He's left. Yeah.
There he's there.
Fine.